with, am I audible? Wait.
Please continue.
Okay, so the purpose of this session today is essentially to emphasize on the additional focus on regulatory compliance and regulatory compliance management in light of the center's decision to have this more focused discussion around Make in India. Now, all of you know what is Make in India, and therefore I don't think we need to get into the details of that all over again. But in broad terms, for MSMEs like ours, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to be working with potentially global, multinational corporations, which will now start manufacturing in India. It's also an opportunity for us to make in India for both India as well as other jurisdictions. The question that obviously comes is, what does this? Why should this even bring back focus on compliance? Now, obviously, compliance in itself is fairly important and fairly relevant in everyday discussions, irrespective of Make in India or not. But what Make in India really does, and if you come to slide 2, what it does is bring into fore some of the critical aspects which are relevant, particularly from global clients' perspective. The first of them being that I think a lot of us in the MSME sector, primarily because of the various other challenges that we face in terms of operations, in terms of trying to grow, in terms of cash flow. There are so many different issues that are faced by the micro, small and medium enterprises. Just our day-to-day struggle to stay afloat and make sure that we are competitive makes it very difficult for us to set up processes in areas which are not really core to us, which would essentially mean areas such as compliance, which are at the best supportive functional aspects to our life, and naturally and understandably don't form a critical and core purpose or core focus of our business, which essentially means that we are primarily dependent on some internal support in some cases by way of a company secretary or a finance professional, or in many cases supported by a third-party vendor who essentially tells us about the few forms that we need to file, the few registers that we need to maintain, and then the rest is really about just running with the business and hoping more than anything else that things don't go wrong. What essentially that means is that we are currently using primarily a manual approach to compliance. We are more reactive than proactive. We don't really set up processes to ensure that we are fully compliant. And as we move on in this presentation, I will try and explain to you what I mean by setting up processes and how one can set up processes. But for the moment, the point that I would like to make is that especially if you're trying to work as a partner or as a vendor to a global company, especially when they are trying to shift some of their manufacturing into India, I'm sure some of you have experienced it firsthand. They are a lot more focused on internal processes, in internal compliance structures, and not just focused on knowing whether all the checklists have been necessarily ticked, which is our standard way of doing compliance. Is we take a checklist, which is usually in a piece of paper, and we just go and start finding out if all the things have been done, and we keep ticking. And only for the things that have not been done, we go and chase things up and close it. Whereas in a process-driven approach, it's more it's really the other way around, where the system throws up any essential breaks, in essential glitches in the compliance framework. The next aspect, of course, is apart from the Indian compliances, what is relevant from the Indian law perspective, especially when we start working with global, manufacturing companies or global, corporations, what also comes to the limelight are global guidelines and policies, which essentially is about having, various kinds of adherence to things which go beyond any one law, any one country's law, but is relevant because, for example, if you are a multinational corporation headquartered in the US, even manufacturers who are working for you in other jurisdictions such as India, Bangladesh, China, need to comply with what is known as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Similarly, if you're working with a manufacturer who has a presence in the United Kingdom, you have to, even your vendors and suppliers and, partners in other countries like ours need to comply with the UK anti-bribery law. Now, therefore, these companies have created their global policies, global guidelines, which as vendors or partners or suppliers or whatever we might become, we need to sign at the beginning of every relationship. Now, what I have noticed in my experience as an in-house counsel is that, and as a matter of fact now as a consultant, is that in many cases we sign up to these documents blindly. So we, at the beginning of a relationship, we are obviously very excited. We are desperately trying to win over our new, potential client. We would not want to disturb them by saying that we have issues with some of these guidelines. So most of us, they send us a huge sheaf of, white, paper with a lot of things written on it. In some cases, we get to give it a perfunctory glance or ask one of our, team members to go through it quickly. And unless there is something dramatic, we sign up to it. Now, essentially, what that means is you are now signing up to the global IT policies, the global, corruption policies, global intellectual property law related policies that this company has. And in many cases, the way we do business currently, for example, if you sign up to the global privacy policies of any of these, international organizations, you are essentially saying that I will have very strong internal information technologies, structures, so that any kind of breach in, privacy as laid down under international norms will be thrown up, and I will immediately highlight it. Now, in most of our cases, we don't have the wherewithal to do that. We haven't set those structures in place, but we are signing up to it primarily because we are desperate to get the deal. Now, this potentially, especially when, there is so much of focus on something like Make in India, there is so much in focus by this current government in making sure that, the Make in India program is successful. Even small glitches, small errors on the part of Indian vendors will be thrown up as huge things, and therefore reputationally it will mean a lot, not just as us as a company, but to the entire plan with regard to Make in India. And therefore even the Indian government will come down a lot more harder on companies which are not in adherence to these global guidelines and policies. So that's the next aspect that we want to talk about. The next aspect, and we'll come to it in greater detail later, is with regard to the adoption of technology. Now, we have done some work with some of the MSMEs. Some of them are part of the CII regime, and we use our compliance management software to manage their compliances. Now, while implementing ComRisk, the tool that we use, which is called ComRisk, what we have noticed is that in many cases, there are over 300 or 400 compliances that these organizations with 3-4 manufacturing units, 3-4 different offices have to do throughout the year. Now, a lot of them currently are probably doing only 10 to 20% of those compliances on a regular basis, which essentially means that if we suddenly now manually start trying to track or adhere to all these large number of additional compliances which have been brought up by virtue of a consultant coming in and looking at your systems, you're looking at your business and suggesting what compliances you need to do, the essential effect of that would be a complete collapse of the system, because suddenly you will need many more people just to do compliances, and that's not the purpose. The purpose is to actually reduce the number of people to make it more efficient, and therefore it is extremely critical. Today there are a number of different technological interventions which are possible. There are cloud-based interventions which doesn't even require you to have a server. You can use just your regular computer and internet facilities to keep track of your compliances. You don't even need a official email ID. You can use something like a Gmail ID to be able to track your compliances. So there are technologies and tools available in India. We would strongly recommend the use of those to make sure that you are more compliant. The added advantage that you get out of this is, if a third party, especially a global organization, is trying to understand how compliant you are, you can just give them access to the application that you're using, and they can easily figure out for themselves how compliant you are. And therefore, you don't need to go through a complex process of them sending you a questionnaire, you sending them huge bunches of documents by courier or scanning and mailing it to them. You can just give access to the tool, give them a username and a password, and give them access for 3 days to a limited extent, and they can just go in there and see what all compliances, what are things you're doing. So apart from obviously your internal processes being more efficient, it will also help you cross these natural and inevitable due diligence related hurdles that are a must as a part of any onboarding process today. And then of course the last, and which I know I keep telling every forum, that there is this general mistaken notion that Indian companies, particularly Indian MSMEs, are naturally non-compliant, that we do not want to comply. And I strongly refute it. I'm a part of the MSME community. LEXPLOSION is a MSME itself. And I strongly believe that most of our organizations, most of our leaderships are extremely keen on being compliant. We actually want to be compliant. It's just that in the struggles that we have in our day-to-day running of organizations, in the day-to-day maintenance of the basics that require an organization to be on its feet, we do not get the time that is required to be fully compliant. B, the fact that we do not start building organizations with compliance processes inherently built in. It becomes difficult once we grow to suddenly bake in the compliance requirements, because then we are already behind and we are trying to make up for lost time. And C, of course, because of the way the Indian compliance structures are set up, the compliances are set up, it is not easy. You have your central laws, you have your state laws, you then have central laws read with state rules. There are lots of complications. If you're a part of a business, you need to do a bunch of things. If you're not a part of one business but a part of another business, you need to do something else. If you have offices in 3 locations, you need to do something. If you're more than 50 people, less than 50 people, so it isn't easy. So even for large organizations, it's an extremely difficult thing to be fully compliant, and the job becomes that much more difficult if you are a part of, if you are an MSME, which, as I said, has so many other complicated issues to be looking at. But having said that, I think most of us conceptually want to be completely intolerant or have zero tolerance towards non-compliance. Unfortunately, our circumstances do not allow us to be fully, fully adherent with this general belief, and as a result of that, in many cases, we end up making mistakes and errors, which then come back to bite us. But as an organization, as leaders of organizations, as people holding responsible positions in organizations, if we start taking that initial step and saying that no, we will have zero tolerance towards non-compliance. We will not try to, find our way by, using unfair or, inappropriate means by, paying, amounts which should not be paid, and solving for what should have been solved in the first place through compliance processes. And if we drive that belief throughout the organization that we do not promote, we do not support bribery, that we do not support alternate means of breaching non-compliance, then the organization will naturally be geared towards the first three things, which is having structured processes, adopting technology without necessarily busting your budgets, and also setting up internal systems and processes to be able to comply with global guidelines and policies. So with that, I think what I wanted to say is that as more and more MNCs move towards India for sourcing their raw materials, the expectations of the Indian suppliers will be of the highest standard. If we are not setting up our processes, if we are not adhering to global guidelines and adopting to technology, we will not be able to demonstrate in the truest manner that we have zero tolerance towards non-compliance. And if we cannot demonstrate that, there is a very possible and high risk, which we will talk about in the next slide. Now, one of the leading global IT hardware companies with, it's a large US listed organization with presence in many countries, including in India. Now, I was in a meeting with their general counsel. They happened to be a client of ours, and what she said, and it resonated with me, is that we believe that a lot of the Indian vendors would be our best sources of supplying raw material, our parts for our factories in India. Unfortunately, 8 out of 10 of the potential vendors inevitably get disqualified in the RFP process because of lack of compliance infrastructure. And we have to source from other countries. Whereas our factories in India, there are manufacturers of spare parts in this country who are excellent, who are extremely competitive on price and quality, but fundamentally they do not qualify, because every time we do a due diligence, we realize that they do not have all the processes required to confirm that they're compliant. And here I will come back to a point that I made briefly in the previous slide, and that is that it isn't enough for these organizations to just be able to show that you have the last quarter's filings done. So just having challans which have been stamped by the government departments to establish that you're compliant for the last quarter or the last 2 quarters, that in itself is not adequate. What they look for is, how will you make sure that you're compliant next time? What internally do you do to make sure that you get ahead of time triggers? How many of the various compliances that you have to do are done by a single source, or how many are done by divergent parts of the organization, and how do these different parts? So if you have 4 different factories, how do you make sure that the Factories Act registration renewal is done on time for all 4 factories and not just by one? What do you internally do to ensure that? And so many other aspects of compliance that come up. And another aspect which comes from our personal experience of doing a variety of different compliance audits for different organizations, one of the key aspects of compliance is, unlike various other parts of law which are typically handled by one set of people, which is typically the legal and compliance team, for example, litigations that a company is faced with, or any contracts that a company does. They are typically done by one small group of people, usually a part of the legal, secretarial, compliance, and in some cases finance team. However, if you look at compliance, as your organization grows, the number of different people in the organization from different parts of the organization, different functions of the organization who are involved with compliance keeps increasing. So unlike with other things which still remain centralized, and therefore it becomes easier with an error in a contract or an error in the litigation process to figure out who was responsible for it, because you know that the number of people who are involved are 3 or 4 at the most. Whereas in compliance, there are different people. There'd be somebody, maybe a junior officer in HR who's doing some compliances. There would be some people from finance, some people from administration, some people from operations, some people from the leadership team, who are all involved in different capacities in ensuring that the organization generally is compliant. Now that makes compliance so much more difficult than many other aspects of of legal or litigation related matters. Because there are so many different potential touch points, as we understand, the number of sources of error or number of failure points also increase. And unless you have internal processes to ensure that each of these various failure points are equally aware or are in an equal position to know what they need to do, there is an inevitable possibility that there will be some point to the other which will fail. So if you have 5 offices, while in 4 your shops and establishment registration might have been renewed on time, or the attendance registers might have been maintained as per the requirements, but in a 5th, because there was a change in maybe a resource, maybe somebody moved out and a new person came in, there is a possibility that the 5th did not do it on time. Whereas if you have a process where if you have an automated system, the chances are that this issue will not come up at all. You will be able to ensure through your process that even if a person changes, the next person gets an ahead of time warning that something needs to be done without having to go back and manually check when it is due, what was the last time, where is that certificate, and we'll come to come to that in a bit more detail as we move on. The next example is that of Gap, the famous clothing clothing manufacturer. Gap terminated its business at 15 factories in China for falsifying payroll records. It quit doing business with vendors representing more than 120 factories worldwide for compliance-related reasons. Now, as we know that India is a large manufacturer of and exporter of garments. We have a number of different clusters where garment is a very critical part of the export business, and Gap is just an example. Most global organizations today have extremely strong internal processes. We all know about what happened with Walmart's India business. We know how when there were the first doubts that some of the potential licenses, etc., had been acquired through illegal means, they immediately did a global audit, terminated a whole bunch of people from different parts of the organization, not just from the legal team, from different parts of the organization, and set up a completely new process just to make sure that this does not happen. These organizations globally take compliance seriously because they do not have the option not to. Because if in their country, if there is an issue that they have with non-compliance, they will face serious consequences from their regulatory authorities, especially for listed organizations. The stock exchanges take such extremely strong exception to any cases of non-compliance that there will be global ramifications for one bribe or one false record that is maintained in a geography which probably contributes less than 10% of the annual revenues, and therefore they're not willing to take that risk. For us, we might think that this is how the business is done. How do you run a business in India without doing these things? It's inevitable. You have to do some of these things. But for them, the global consequence is so large. They will internationally, reputationally, from a regulatory perspective, suffer such great potential loss that they would rather close down the business and take that short-term revenue hit than be going ahead and continuing to do business with organizations which are potentially non-compliant. So that's how seriously they take it. The next example is of Nestle, and which directly leads me up to the point that in case of Nestle, for example, it conducts periodic external audit of its suppliers and co-manufacturers to assess their compliance with environment, health and safety, labor and integrity related compliances. So it's not just taking their word of the suppliers. It's not about suppliers certifying, suppliers signing up to forms. There is also now Nestle, for example, conducts external audits. We as vendors to a number of global organizations, we have our employees who have to go through their training on things like integrity, things like global payment policies, etc., and not just take training. They have to pass tests sometimes every quarter, just to make sure that they're aware of the organization's global policy requirements, because they're working in that process. And during these audits, if there is any glitch that they find, the first thing they go back and check is, was it a one-time error, or is there a systemic process-related failure? And if it's a process-related failure, they will make sure that they stop doing business with them immediately. I will, give you a quote from the International Chamber of Commerce. In their guide to responsible sourcing, it says that companies should make it known to their business partners to comply with all national laws, regulations, including labor and environmental laws. So this is the sourcing guideline, which is being set up by the International Chamber of Commerce, which a large number of these international companies are a part of. Top Europe, according to Smart Investor in Business Standard, they've stated that top European brands sign a pact committing to invest in building and fire safety in Bangladeshi factories from where they buy apparel. So many of you are aware of some of the non-compliances, some of the fire-related issues that have been that have happened in Bangladesh. As a matter of fact, when that happened, some of the Indian garment manufacturers immediately started getting a larger number of orders, because for the European clients, they did not want to do business again with the with organizations or with smaller vendors who have potential regulatory issues. So today, as a sign of their commitment to the concept of compliance, what they are doing is they're signing up to commitments where they're saying that they will invest. I'm sorry. No, I'm still on the previous slide. They will invest in, so that they will invest in building safer workplaces in places like Bangladesh. That is how seriously they're taking compliance. So I'm on the 5th block of the 6 blocks of slide number 3. The last block talks about a statement which was recently made by the Union Environment Minister in India, Prakash Javadekar. What he said was that there will be freedom from Inspector Raj, but not compliance. Quality of air and water will be maintained. Clearance will come quickly, but compliance will be enforced. This is a very similar statement as is being made by the New Delhi Chief Minister, that I will ensure that inspectors don't come and harass you. I will ensure that you do not have to go and unnecessarily pay up, extra legal amounts of money. But it does not mean that you can get away from being compliant. So, in the current context of Make in India, where there is a renewed focus on India, there's a renewed international focus on India, there is a real hope again that the economy will grow at the desired levels as we were hoping in terms of GDP. There is an extremely important role that compliance will play, because if we do not follow the rules that are set in the global market in terms of what is the acceptable standards of environment, health and safety, what are the acceptable standards of a workplace, of fire, of other kinds of hazards, if you're what kinds of minimum wages are we paying, what kinds of additional benefits are being paid to our various types of workmen and personnel. They scrutinize these things because it's not just about having filled up a form and being able to prove on the face of it that you're compliant. They would like to see that you have systems and processes and that you're actually complying with it each time to make sure that they don't fall foul of their regulators at an international level. And therefore, that's the message that I wanted to send through slide 3, that compliance is extremely critical in the context of Make in India. And it's not just in international compliances. There's a general belief, and this is something that we notice a lot as we talk to our clients, that there is a general belief that why should our senior management be so worried? Compliance can be done by 2-3 of our younger junior resources who can just go and meet with the labor inspectors, the pollution control board members, and make sure that the right palms are greased, and with that we can get away with non-compliance. But there's been a CII report which was published recently in conjunction with Deloitte, and what came out from that is what is there in the first block in slide number 4, which is the effort investment. So what came out is that the senior management in most organizations end up spending 480 man days of effort on compliance. There is a 1,500 man-day effort annually by the middle management on compliance, and there is a 1,780 man-day of effort by junior management in compliance. While this is a cross-section, and this is not necessarily a reflection of only the MSME sector, but it's a reflection of the overall larger industrial situation. Even if I reduce these numbers by say 90%, it's still 48 man days of senior management effort. It's still 150 man days of middle management effort. It's still 178 man days of junior management effort. If you convert this in terms of the actual effort, you are spending almost 3 to 4 people worth of effort just trying to remain compliant, whereas with the effective tools, internal processes, policies, you could probably reduce it to just one person with a larger group of people in the organization taking their responsibilities seriously and doing their compliances as and when they came out. The other aspect that I wanted to talk about, which is in the second block of slide number 4, is with regard to prosecution and conviction. Now, there is this strange notion which is harbored by international communities, by our own regulators and media, and also strangely by a lot of us in the business, that in India you can get away with non-compliance, that there is no real worry about getting prosecuted or even lesser worry of getting convicted. If you look at the numbers, this is again from the Q&A sessions of the Lok Sabha, which have been collectively, collected, and from that what we notice is that between 2010 and September 2013, there were 16,195 prosecutions launched under just one act, and that's the Contract Labor Act. We all believe that under the Contract Labor Act, as long as you have got your principal employer registration and as long as you're renewing it on time, you are compliant with the Contract Labor Act. As a matter of fact, there is nothing which is further from the truth. If you take that principal employer registration, which you should absolutely take if you have more than 20 or more contractors, the number of compliances that you have to do actually is over 20 for every unit where Contract Labor Act applies. You have to ensure that the contractor's employees receive certain benefits. If they do not receive it, it is your responsibility to ensure that they are getting paid and then subsequently deducting it from the contractor, which includes things like Provident Fund, which includes things like minimum wages. I have personally had to go along with a very senior executive of again a telecom company to the inspector, because the inspector came and pointed out that in their case a lot of their vendors were not paying minimum wages, and this person said, I don't know that, I have no way of checking. In today's day and age where people are actually paying salaries directly into bank accounts, how can I go and check whether their amounts are right or wrong? And what the inspector said is, did you ask them for their bank account details? I understand that in earlier days when people were being paid by cash, you could actually stand and verify how much they were being paid, and it becomes difficult now with the revised scenario where a lot of people even at the junior level are paid through bank transfers, but at least did you try and get the bank account details of these employees? And he said, well, no, honestly I did not. And he said, that's what you really need to do. So there were 60,195 prosecutions, and even more interestingly, 13,000 plus convictions in just a 3-year time period under one enactment. Even innocuous enactments like the Equal Remuneration Act had 3,421 convictions during a 3-year period. The Minimum Wages Act had a 20,000 plus prosecution and another 20,000 plus convictions. And things like the Minimum Wages Act, as some of you who are in the manufacturing sector will absolutely know, is extremely difficult to keep track of, because the Minimum Wages Act is read with the various state minimum wages rules, and the minimum wages rules schedules with regard to which class of people need to get what minimum wages usually changes twice a year. And in many cases the notification and the of the minimum wages change and the actual date of being able to get is significant, and therefore a lot of companies that we know end up having to pay a fair amount of amounts of money with retrospective effect with penal interest, because they did not even know that the minimum wages have changed. These are things that which to us seems like fine, but for an international vendor or for a international client, that is something that will immediately raise their hackers. They will immediately ask, so does it mean that you don't even pay your workmen minimum wages? And the answer is no, I actually pay the minimum wages. It's just that there was a change and I did not even get to know about it. And the fact is that in many cases, these are the reasons why global clients, potential partners back out of deals, because they're worried. They're worried that we hear such stories about India being non-compliant, about vendors here not following the rules of the game. I do not want to take a chance because you seem to have a conviction with regard to non-payment of minimum wages, and that is way too much of a risk for me to take. I don't want to really delve into the depths of when did the notification get notified, when did you get to know about it, why didn't you get to know about it earlier, why other people also face the same problem. I don't want to take that risk. It's just too much risk for me. And therefore, they would rather just back off and go off to another vendor, or maybe not even to within this country, and go off to another country. So I wanted to show you that it's not just that it's lip service. There are real prosecutions, real convictions happening right here in India by the thousands in enactments which we would think would usually be you would be able to get away with by greasing the right palms. Clearly that's not working. Clearly there are lots of inspectors, lots of people who want to do their job the right way. And when they're finding problems with companies like ours, they are actually taking us to task. And some interesting cases of non-compliance, and we can fill up many slides with just information like this, but I just wanted to share with you three case studies, and my apologies, of examples where despite people believing that they're compliant, very senior people in the organization ended up being in jail. One of them is a very famous case of a massive fire which happened in one of the largest and most popular hospitals in Calcutta a few years back. Now, when this happened, a number of patients and other hospital staff and other people were killed in this fire, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this incident. Now, when this happened, the first thing that the administrators and owners of this hospital, who are all very reputed industrialists, said is that we had got an appropriate fire license to run our premise, and we had taken all steps that were required. What the fire department turned back and said is, no, they had only applied for a fire license, they never got one. And I don't know how many of you have faced this in your practical lives, where we go and get a stamp on a form while submitting it and run our business with that, with the assumption that because I have applied for it, I have got it. In many cases, the application might have been rejected. And the way the government departments in India run, in many cases you would not even know about it. They wouldn't even have officially communicated to you unless somebody goes and asks them specifically that it has been rejected, or that a new set of things have been asked from you before they confirm it. And you would go on doing your business under the mistaken notion that you have got you are actually certified to do what you are doing. And the fact is that you actually are not. Until the time that an incident like that hospital fire happens, there is this belief that we are fine, and nobody comes and asks any questions. So you think business is happening fine, and maybe what you as leaders of the organization don't even know is that somebody lower down in the organization is actually probably paying off somebody in the fire department or some other department and making sure that there is no trouble. But the day something like a fire actually happens, on that day, neither that inspector who received money nor your junior employee who was probably involved in this activity of bribing would come up and say that don't worry, we will not prosecute you. On that day, it's the directors who are going to jail. That's for sure. And that's exactly what happened in this case. These very famous industrialists who probably were sleeping peacefully, believing that they're fully compliant, ended up having to spend several months in jail. Similarly, another example of a blast in a steel plant in Odisha, again something that you would probably know about. What was held was that they are not compliant with the Factories Act of 1948, and the result was, of course, that their business was closed down. Again, a case that you would definitely know about. I'm deliberately not taking the names of these companies, but you would probably know about these cases. And the fact is, when you are not complying with the Factories Act, and if you look at the penalty and you say that okay, the penalty for non-compliance is okay, 10,000 rupees, 20,000 rupees. There is an outside chance of jail, but then you know that in most cases this does not happen, and you believe that okay, what's the risk really? I can go ahead and not comply with this what seems like an innocuous compliance, because at the end of the day, the potential risk is maybe at the most 50,000 rupees or 100,000 rupees, which is not that much of money anymore. But how do you factor in the closure of business? How do you factor in, how do you calculate, and this is something that we keep talking about, that unlike with many other financial risks, where it is very easy to calculate the risk of non-compliance because there are very, very clear measurable numbers out there, and you can say, okay, potential risk of 5 crores, 10 crores, contingent liability. In case of compliance, the only risk which is clearly measurable is the potential penalty, which in India for most laws, especially in areas like labor, is still very, very small. So the penalty is not really the risk and not really the only measure for risk. How do you measure the risk of a director going to jail? How do you give it a monetary term? Similarly, how do you measure the reputational risk? When a hospital is closed down because it did not comply with fire norms, the implications, even if I assume that they can open it, in this case they took almost 2 years to come back into business, but even if I assume that they came back into business after a month, reputationally it is so difficult to convince patients to go back to that hospital. Now when you look at this from an international perspective, if you're manufacturing as a part of Make in India for global organizations, if any such incident happens, you will not just be blacklisted by that particular client, but you will most certainly get blacklisted by the entire industry into which you were planning to supply. Because none of those organizations which, with their, global sensitivities, with their stock exchange sensitivities, would want to do business with an organization which has this kind of a reputation. And that reputation, loss of reputation and the risk of loss of reputation is extremely difficult to compute, which is why risk professionals usually struggle especially in context of countries like India, where the penal consequences in terms of financial loss are not significant, to actually measure and come out with clear understanding of what is the risk of non-compliance. Similarly, another example, again a very famous company, all of these are famous companies, I'm sure you've heard of this, an executive director of a large shoe manufacturing company in Haryana ended up spending 6 months in jail for non-compliance with the Contract Labor Act. Now, we believe that these things don't happen, but they do. And in India, once you're in jail, coming out is extremely difficult unless you really know the right people. Therefore, the reputational loss again is extremely high. Apart from, of course, the loss of liberty and the obvious implications of being in a prison environment. So there's a personal aspect to it, but there's a larger corporate reputation, corporate ability to do business in the international market, which all come into play. And therefore, even in the Indian context, non-compliance is really not an option. Even if we forget about the international community and how they view compliance, even in the Indian context, non-compliance is not really an option, which is viable, which is possible for any of us to consider as something that we would like to do in the shorter term. Which brings me to slide number 5. Now, there's a lot of talk in the media and even in the legal community about the Companies Act of 2013 and what it implies for various companies, and aspects like corporate social responsibility, roles of independent directors are hugely talked about in the media and as well as in the legal community. But for most of us who are still fairly small in our scale and size in the MSME sector, things like the corporate social responsibility related compliances or compliances with regard to independent directors, which is primarily with listed entities, is not really the biggest challenge, the biggest concern, because most of them don't even apply to most of our companies. To me, the biggest challenge in the new Companies Act from a small entity perspective, because this provision applies to all companies, is section 134(5)(f) of the Companies Act, which says that the directors have to certify annually as a part of the annual report that they have devised proper systems to ensure compliance with the provisions of all applicable laws, and that such systems were adequate and operating effectively. So it's not just about certifying that you are compliant. That in itself is difficult. Here, what a director is really certifying as that they are ensuring that there are systems in place to comply with laws, and those systems are adequate and operating effectively, which essentially means that there is a far higher level of responsibility that is being cast on directors. This is completely new. This existed in a different format under the listing agreement, which applied only to listed entities in India, under clause 49 of the listing agreement, as some of you in the from the legal and compliance and market would know, or the space would know. But this did not apply to small companies or private companies at all. But today, any company, irrespective of scale or size of operations, has to certify, as in the directors have to certify, that they have systems in place. And the implication of having certified and it turning out to be false is a jail term which could potentially be up to 3 years. Again, the Companies Act of 2013 is brand new. Prosecutions under this act are just about beginning. I do not know of any case where any company has really been hauled up for a breach of section 134(5)(f), but the first set of such breaches will probably come after the first set of annual returns are filed after the 2014-15 financial year comes to an end. The chances of that are limited. It's probably more likely to happen after the 2015-16 financial year is over and annual returns are filed. That prosecution under these provisions will come in. But you're again certifying as directors. Therefore, when you are a part of this global environment where India is the focus, a certificate being issued by a director that they're compliant with laws is what is probably what they, an international client or an international partner will ask you for in a few more years. That show me your certification. And if in any way that certification turns out to be false, you are potentially likely to be, signing up to very high, liability as a part of the contractual understanding that you end up signing with your vendor. Most of these contracts have a liability provision. As vendors, what we try to do is limit that liability. Usually that limit is for certain things, but not there for some other things. So one of the things where I'm sure you'll have extreme difficulty, your lawyers will find extreme difficulty in convincing your client that there should be a limitation on liability in case there is that it is proved that your certification under section 134(5)(f) is inaccurate. You will find it extremely difficult to get that limitation. So you'll have unlimited liability and therefore have a very high risk financially in terms of a breach of this section, not just under the Indian Act, under the Companies Act, where you potentially face a jail term, but also with your business partners across the world. So what does all this mean? And I'm sensitive to time. I think we are reaching the end of the first hour. I'll try and wrap up in the next 30 to 35 minutes, and then hopefully be able to take some questions from all of you in the last half an hour. So I'm on slide number 6, where we have basically looked at 4 aspects: compliance identification, compliance application, compliance review, but ahead of everything else, process improvement. Now, what do we mean by this? Now, one is, if I go into an organization, and this, we do compliance assessments or audits for various types of organizations of different scale and size. What we do as a part of that audit in many cases is we don't look at just the certifications, the filings, the renewals, the consents, because that's just the tip of the iceberg. Like I was saying, under the Contract Labor Act, if it's established that our client is a principal employer, that they have taken the registration under the Contract Labor Act, what we really look for is, for example, how do they keep track of how much their vendor employees or their contractor employees are getting paid? What is the system in place to ensure that every time you onboard a new vendor, you have a way of knowing what each of their employees who are working on your premise are getting paid? How do you verify it? How do you ensure that Provident Fund is actually being deducted and submitted? How do you ensure that minimum wages are being paid? What do you do to make sure that they are being provided with the kind of sanitary facilities, canteen-related facilities that are required under the enactment? And what kind of documentation do you maintain to ensure that if a question is asked subsequently, you have all the documentary evidence to show that you took all due care? And therefore, for me, compliance is not about these monthly returns, annual returns, renewals. Compliance is about knowing, because as I mentioned earlier, compliance is not owned by 1 or 2 people. In most organizations, compliance is owned by a very large part of the organization. And as a result of that, it isn't enough to be able to just say that, I have some documents, I have some certificates, I can show you a file. What the international community or us as auditors are really looking for is process. What do you do every time? Sure, you have got it renewed this time. How do I know that you internally have the process to ensure that you will renew it next time as well? So if you have 10 establishments and therefore 10 shops and establishment registration renewals, and even if you've done it right the last 10 times, I will ask you, what is your process to ensure that next time you get it right? And if you then tell me, well, we have people who have, documents, they have calendar alerts on their email system on Outlook, my inevitable question will be, what happens if this person leaves the organization? His calendar Outlook calendar will go with him. How do you make sure that the next person who's joining the organization is equally aware about when that renewal is due? What if there are sets of compliances? In many cases, especially under the environmental clearances, pollution control board clearances, you have situations where it's not just a certification which says you are certified to do business. With fire licenses, you have conditions attached that you need to do these following things. You need to file these quarterly returns. You need to send these samples from time to time. You need to do a bunch of things as qualifications to that compliance certification that you've received, that license to operate that you've received. Are you doing those things? Who in the organization gets triggers? How do they know? What happens if this person moves on, if something happens to that person? That is what we mean by saying process improvement. How can you create a process? How can you improve the process every time there is a change in law, every time there is a change in your status? For example, you might be following a process which is absolutely appropriate for compliance with Indian laws. But what happens if you now start doing business with an international organization which requires you to do 10 additional things? How do you bake that into that process? So what is your internal mechanism to ensure that every time there is a change in your situation, you are able to add that additional portion and improve your process? Which brings me to the issue of change management. What is the way of ensuring that if there is a person in your organization who's moving on, if you become a part of a larger organization by way of, say, acquisition, what is the method of ensuring that adequate change management happens? Having looked at process improvement, I will come to what is an extremely critical portion, especially in the context of India, which is compliance identification. We are talking about, like I said, many hundred compliances even for small organizations. We have worked with one of the largest FMCG companies in the world in their Indian operations. They have 75 plus factories. They have many third-party factories, many other operations. And when we mapped the compliances, because we had to do it by factory, we ended up mapping 58,000 rows of compliance for them. Now, in these kind of situations, even for small companies, how do I really know that I'm fully aware of all the laws and all the compliances? How can I challenge my vendor? A lot of times when we go to our clients, we say that, how do you ensure that you know about all the laws that are applicable to you? Their inevitable answer is, I have a vendor, and that vendor does all the compliances for me. So I don't have to worry about all this. My vendor worries about it. And our inevitable next question is, how do you know that your vendor is fully aware of all the compliances? How do you know that your vendor is keeping themselves duly informed about all the changes that are happening? How do you know that your vendor is not, I'm not saying in a nefarious way, but just out of pure negligence, not missing out on critical compliances and only telling you about the ones that are most obvious, like the registrations and filings. A ballpark number, but if you look at the total number of compliances under each act and you see how many of that actually requires you to do a regular filing or maintain a register, it will turn out to be less than 20%. The total number of compliances are much larger. There are proactive ongoing compliances, as we call them, compliances which you have to do on an ongoing basis. For example, under the new Sexual Harassment Act, you need to have a sexual harassment committee at all times. Now, in many cases, when we evaluate our organizations and do assessments, and we ask them for that where is your sexual harassment committee? Who are their members? Do you have a third party? What is the person's name? the question that comes up is, there isn't one yet, but as and when there is, because we are a small organization, we have never had a case of sexual harassment being reported. So whenever there is, we will set up a committee. And there are huge amounts of case law to now justify that that does not work. There are so many cases, there are so many instances where the absence of a sexual harassment committee has been seen as a serious breach of the Sexual Harassment Act as it stands now, and previously of the Supreme Court judgment in the case of Vishakha versus State of Rajasthan. Now, therefore, in cases like that, there is no filing. You don't need to have filed anything, but you need to have a committee at all times. Similarly, if I look at the Information Technology Act, and I'm only talking about enactments which are universal, which apply to all companies irrespective of your scale and size. Every company under the which uses computer resources, computer in any form to do their business is covered by Information Technology Act in one form or the other. And one of the critical requirements under one of the most talked about rules of the Information Technology Act, which is the Sensitive Personal Data or Information Rules of 2011, talks about the need for a privacy policy which has to be uploaded on the company's website. And as a part of that, there is a requirement to have a grievance officer whose name needs to be published on the website. Now, as a standard test, so we do Information Technology Act related audits and assessments for a number of different companies. And one of the first things that we do is go and check their website to see if they have a privacy policy uploaded, if the privacy policy has all the various aspects that are talked about under the 2011 SPDI rules, and do they have the grievance officer's name mentioned. 9 out of 10 with large organizations, we have actually noticed that they do not have the grievance officer's name mentioned. In many cases, the privacy policy is either not there or is not as per the requirements of the Information Technology Act. Now, does it mean that the organization is deliberately non-compliant? The answer in most cases is an emphatic no. As a matter of fact, in most cases, organizations would want to comply, just that they do not have the infrastructure wherewithal to keep track of all the laws and identify all the compliances. What is even more relevant is that in a country like India and in most other democratic nations, the laws change. Laws change fairly often. I gave you earlier an example of the minimum wages rules, which change usually twice in most states. There are other acts, other rules which are changing. Some changes are small, some changes are large. For manufacturing companies and representatives of manufacturing companies present here, you would know that there was the Standard of Weights and Measures Act, which has now been completely replaced with the Legal Metrology Act. The Companies Act of 1956, which so many of us were so used to and which was so integral to our lives, has now been replaced with the 2013 Companies Act. Now, there's a significant amount of knowledge that needs to then change. What we thought was the last word in terms of the law has changed now, and therefore it is not easy for us to constantly know what these changes are and map those and identify those compliances. What is even more difficult, and something that we talked about, is really about compliance risk mapping. How do I, in the context of my business, in the context of what I do, in the context of all the various stakeholders who are involved with my business, identify the risk of non-compliance for the various things that, various compliances that apply to me? It is, what seems like, and I'll give you a very interesting example of something that we have noticed regularly. When we go to some of our larger, clients in the telecom, banking, non-banking financial corporations, we always initially believed that their primary and fundamental need will be in the telecom sector for telecom compliances, in the banking sector for banking compliances, and that's turned out to be wrong. In most cases, what we hear from these companies is, you know what, I have a very large set of people who's taking care of regulatory compliances for telecom that are being passed by the TRI. I don't need support on TRI-related compliances because I have a big team doing that. I don't need support on Banking Regulatory Act-related compliances because I have a big team doing that. I really need help with compliances which are in the labor side, on the environmental health and safety side, on the corporate compliances side, areas where I don't have a big team. Therefore, what often seems like high-risk compliances to us is actually low risk for them because they've been able to mitigate it adequately. It doesn't mean that the risk of non-compliance is low. It means internally they know about it adequately, they have taken adequate steps, therefore internally when they are measuring the risk of non-compliance of this one, they would rate it lower because they have been able to mitigate that risk. Whereas for various other things, where there are disparate groups of people across different parts of the organization doing the same compliance in different cities and states, they are far more worried of non-compliance and the potential risks of that. And because of the lack of knowledge of these, and therefore the potentials of maybe a director going to jail for a breach of one of those being higher, they actually rate this as higher risk. So compliance risk mapping as a part of the compliance identification process is something that we strongly encourage and something that we believe is extremely critical for a viable compliance management program. The next part of this is, of course, compliance application. Do you really have a scalable technology to be able to A, know what your compliances are, B, map those compliances internally to the relevant stakeholders? If you have 5 factories in one state, do you know that whether all the factory managers are equally aware of the various compliances under the Factories Act and other allied manufacturing, labor, and operational laws? How do you make sure that a change in the law is equally and uniformly and known at the same time by all these different factory managers? If you have a software, if you have a tool, a technology doing this, it is possible to, by just clicking a few buttons, ensure that. You can ensure that if a factory manager goes away, automatically as soon as that email ID is deactivated, somebody in the organization can be told that, this person's gone, who does these compliances now? And then immediately they can be reassigned to another person. So the potential of, missing out on stuff because somebody moved away, because you did not know, because, some people were not equally, aware, those are reduced. The risks of non-compliance by virtue of those things get reduced significantly. Like I mentioned, it becomes easier to assign tasks. Therefore, it is easier to also monitor them. You would be able to get alerts and escalations. So if a person is for some reason not completing whatever task is on their plate, it is then possible to make sure that somebody in the organization who is an escalation point or a reviewer for those compliances are made aware of this, the fact that this person is not doing it. You can create your dashboards, you can see your internal mechanism, somebody in a leadership position gets a uniform view of the various compliances that need to be done. Along with that, what a compliance application also does is helps you conduct internal surveys, be aware of any internal incidents. If an inspector has come to any factory and served a notice on you, you can use the tool, you can use the application to track that notice, to make sure that the right people in the organization are aware that such a notice has been served on you, are aware of what has been done, what steps have been taken, how the matter was closed, so that if the same thing happens in the same factory or another factory the next day, you are fully aware of what happened the last time and can take steps to correct whatever is wrong. A compliance application also gives you an immediate view of all locations simultaneously. You don't need to go and do detailed audits ask each of these parts of the organization to send you certifications. You can do it on your own. Which brings me to the last and most critical part of this, which is compliance review. All of these, once done, will continue to run on their own, but what would be important is to keep track through compliance audits, through ensuring regulatory assessments, regulatory updates, risk assessments, and at the end of the day, something like this, like I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, will give not just you and your organization the satisfaction that you've done everything practically possible to remain compliant. You would have also demonstrated to a third party who could be a potential partner, a client, or even an external, regulator, that there are systems and processes in place that you have put in. You will be able to give your section 134(5)F compliance certification with a lot more honesty and genuineness. And at the end of the day, you will have an organization. And now is, especially for smaller organizations, and I'm aware that, there might be, hello, I'm getting a message here. I'm not sure whether you can hear me now, but unless I'm told otherwise, I'll continue. But, you will be able to demonstrate that you have taken appropriate steps. You will be able to demonstrate that you were genuine in your efforts in remaining compliant. A lot of the guideline-driven compliances, and I'll just quickly talk a little bit about the Information Technology Act, for example. In India, it's a more modern enactment, which has which is more guideline-driven. So coming back to the same sensitive personal data, or, information rules of 2011, if you read, rules 8, 9, what it talks about is that you need to get a certification. It could be a ISO 27001 certification, for example. Now, what the rule specifically states is that if you get this certification, and despite that certification, if there is a breach, the fact that you got a certification will be used as a mitigating factor and will help you reduce your liability for the breach. So what the law is essentially saying is that we recognize that despite your best efforts, there can still be information technology related breaches, violations, a breach of a personal information. If you have demonstrated that you took all due steps and measures, we will, to at least a large extent, absolve you of your liability for that breach. And that is exactly the way in which most laws are progressively moving. They're more guideline driven. If you can demonstrate that you took all the appropriate steps, for example, in case of 134(5)F, if you can prove that you did, bring in technology, you did take appropriate steps, and to ensure that there is an effective and accurate process to comply with all laws, even after that, if there is a breach, I'm sure, you will, in most cases, it will either be condoned, or your liability or your, penalty will be significantly reduced by virtue of this demonstration. Similarly, in the context of Make in India, for your third-party clients, for your third-party partners, they would be a lot more satisfied if you could establish that you have processes in place. And in those cases, your chances of getting away with a non-compliance would be much higher than if you cannot demonstrate that you have systems and processes in place to remain compliant. Brings me to my last slide, which is slide number 7. Just 1 second. So a quick note on LEXPLOSION. We are a regulatory compliance management company. I'm a lawyer. I'm the CEO of LEXPLOSION, and I'm a lawyer myself. We have over 50 lawyers across the country, several very senior lawyers, all working in the regulatory compliance management space. We work very closely with CII, and we have conducted a number of MSME roadshows for the last 2 years with CII in the space of regulatory compliance and the need for adoption of technology. We are also, working with CII in ensuring that our compliance management software Comdesk is available as a part of the My CII portal. We have a dedicated center of excellence on regulatory compliance matters, and we'd be very happy to, be of assistance to you. I would be happy to take any questions. We have about, I think, 30 odd minutes. Happy to take any questions that you may have for me. And I know that they have to come through a moderator. I try to answer as many of these questions to the best of my abilities here. If there are questions that I cannot answer either by virtue of my lack of knowledge or due to lack of time, I'll be happy to take them back and respond to them subsequently. Thank you so much for your time and patience. I really appreciate this opportunity and for your patience in listening to me and hearing about this extremely critical issue of the need for regulatory compliance in the Make in India regime. Thank you so much for your time.